Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 4, Episode 1. The Return of the King. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. As a recap, if you're listening to Pax for the first time, last episode we saw the end of a constitutional experiment which started with the execution of Charles I in January 1649. Since that cold winter morning, the three kingdoms of England, Scotland and Ireland had gone through 11 years of political upheaval. England became a republic under the Rump Parliament, and then conquered Scotland and Ireland with a powerful army. The Republic was then overthrown by that army, led by Oliver Cromwell, who had grown impatient with the slow pace of reform and their inability to pay his soldiers. A new nominated assembly was created, nicknamed the Bare Bones Parliament, which was meant to quickly arrive at a new constitutional order before voting itself out of existence. But when it too struggled to get things done, Cromwell once again sent in the soldiers. What emerged from the pen of John Lambert was the instrument of government, and a new title for Cromwell, Lord Protector. The Protectorate was not quite a kingdom, and it wasn't quite a military dictatorship, but it could never find its feet. Despite intense pressure from his closest advisers, Cromwell refused to become a king, but when he died, his eldest son Richard became Lord Protector. Unable to hold together a regime which was balanced between a powerful army and a moderate civilian faction, Tumble-Down Dick tumbled down. The army then brought back the Rump Parliament they had once expelled, only to expel it a second time. And then, in the final episodes of Season 3, we saw General George Monk invade from Scotland, expel the military junto which had expelled the Rump, then bring back the MPs which had first been purged to create the Rump 11 years before. The restored Long Parliament then ordered new elections, which created the Convention Parliament, and then they invited back the King. We finished last season with Charles II returning to London for the first time since he fled the capital with his family when he was just 11 years old. 19 years later, he returned to the city on his 30th birthday. It marked a true revolution in the old sense of the term. The turn of the world back to where it had once started. Some contemporaries called it this, and the new government tried to wipe away any trace of the past 11 years from the law and society. But, as we'll cover today, not everything could go back to the way it had been. All three kingdoms had gone through a generation of upheaval in their societies, their religions, and their politics, and this could not be easily undone. But they were, once again, three kingdoms. The union between England and Scotland was dissolved on the Restoration. Both kingdoms were once again independent, albeit in a personal union where England was the stronger partner. Ireland was a different matter. It was once again its own kingdom, but Ireland was not treated as a partner at all. When the Parliament of Ireland created the title of King of Ireland and gave it to Henry VIII, they stipulated that it was united with the Crown of England. This subservience to London was justified by right of conquest, first by centuries of Anglo-Norman history, then the forces of Elizabeth I, and finally by the armies of Oliver Cromwell. It was this last conquest which had forced a new settlement onto Ireland. Economic and political power had been stripped from Catholic Irish. Their lands had been granted to English and Scottish Protestants and a minority of Irish Protestants. With only a few adjustments, this remained the case after the Restoration. There were many people happy with the Restoration. Old Royalists, who had been loyal to the House of Stuart throughout the interregnum, as it was rather wiggishly called, were top of the list. The Marquis of Ormond, who had tried so hard to maintain the King's position in Ireland, who had struggled to build a coalition between both Royalist and Parliamentarian Protestants, and then between Protestant and Catholic Royalists. He returned with his king, and was elevated from the Marquis of Ormond to the Duke of Ormond. In 1662, he will return to his old position of Lord Deputy of Ireland. One figure who has also been at the side of both Charles I and II was Edward Hyde, the moderate parliamentarian who had been so repelled by the radicalism he saw in the House of Commons that he defected in 1642. He had since been a chief advisor to both Charleses, and with the Restoration he was rewarded with an earldom. From here on, Edward Hyde was the Earl of Clarendon. He will have a key role in the first years of the Restoration, but apparently he didn't have a hand in one of the more intimate developments of these years. His daughter Anne became involved with Prince James, the Duke of York, so involved that when they got married in 1660, their first child appeared just 2 months later. Some people would call that efficient. Others called it scandalous. The son, called Charles, did not live long, which was sadly common for the couple. Of their 8 children, 6 died young. The 2 that lived were daughters, Mary and Anne. It might be worth keeping an eye on those 2. There were also ample rewards on offer for the men who had defected from the parliamentarian cause and shepherded the Restoration. Chief amongst them was, of course, George Monk. Monk was elevated to the peerage by several ranks at once. Monk went from a 3rd son of a relatively impoverished Devon family, who had had to become a professional soldier to make ends meet, to the Duke of Albemarle, the Lord Deputy of Ireland, with massive estates in both England and Ireland. His friends and relatives were elevated along with him. Albemarle would only be Lord Deputy of Ireland until 1662, when ill health meant he passed it back to Ormond. Also benefiting from his personal role in the Restoration was Edward Montague, who had brought the Stuarts back to England on his ship after months of secret collusion. He became the Earl of Sandwich. The rivalry between these 2 men in the new government, Albemarle and Sandwich, will be a common thread in future episodes. Speaking of that, Charles's new English Privy Council was fairly inclusive, in that it held members who had fought on various sides of the wars. The new Earl of Clarendon, Edward Hyde, was foremost among the constitutional royalists. Also at the table was the Duke of Ormond, who represented the royalist military effort as well as the Irish royalists. Denzil Halls was back, the face of the wartime parliamentarians. The new Duke of Albemarle, Monk, was the head of former Cromwellians. The old system of Parliament, Lords and Commons, was of course back, and the place of the king in this system was very much back to the way it had been before the wars. Charles was restrained by tradition and precedent, but this also returned to the king his complete authority over the military and the justice system. Parliament remained in control of the purse strings, tax could not be levied without parliamentary consent, and Charles could not get around this with innovations like ship money, like his father had done. The changes and reforms which Charles I had agreed to prior to the Civil War were kept. The Triennial Act required a parliament to be summoned at least once every 3 years, and the despised prerogative courts, like Star Chamber, were not coming back. But one thing which the Restoration could not turn the clock back on was religion. Not that the government didn't try. Anglicanism, as in a mainstream Book of Common Prayer state church backed by bishops, was back. The many different offshoots, with Quakers and Baptists being the largest, were now discriminated against with new penal laws. These became known as the Clarendon Code, named after their supposed author. But the variety of sects which had sprouted and spread during the last 20 years was a genie which would not go back in the bottle. Now, let us turn to those individuals who lost out, because though the restored king had promised few reprisals, someone had to be punished for the last 20 years, and it was different in all 3 kingdoms. Let's begin with England. In August 1660, the Convention Parliament passed an Act of Indemnity and Oblivion. This offered a pardon for all crimes committed against the monarchy. Only 33 individuals were specifically exempted from this, such as the living regicides, the men who had tried, convicted, and signed the death warrant of Charles I. Originally, only 7 names were on the list of those exempt from the pardon. They included the most infamous radicals of the Revolution, figures like Thomas Harrison. But over 2 months, the Convention Parliament debated and disagreed, struck names from the list and added new ones. As more records were discovered or suspects and witnesses testified, attitudes within the convention hardened. Charles did put out proclamations which promised, or at least implied, mercy for most people involved in the regicide if they came forwards, and so dozens of people handed themselves in. But though there was not a counter-revolutionary massacre, the Restoration regime had something to prove. The king wanted revenge for his father. Ardent royalists wanted the outrage of the regicide to be punished. The Convention Parliament was not only made up of unimpeachable royalists, it also included many former parliamentarians, men who had fought Charles I as well as Charles II. They now found themselves in the king's good books, or at least not in his bad books, and if they had to prove their loyalty by coming down hard on their former allies, then so be it. And even if they'd been on the same side in the civil wars, there were still grudges to settle. 10 regicides were sentenced to death in 1660, and all but one were condemned to the traitor's death, to be hanged until unconscious, then castrated and disemboweled, and then finally beheaded, with their body then chopped into quarters. Hanged, drawn, quartered. The condemned regicides went to their deaths with either outraged defiance or stoic acceptance. The fifth monarchist Thomas Harrison was unrepentant at his trial, and went to the scaffold with a smile. When he was heckled by the crowd, he heckled them right back. He was hanged and castrated, which lasted for 4 days. It involved skirmishes all across the city, and they killed around 20 people. But Bennet was driven more by millenarian zealotry than strategic thought. 50 men, and 1 woman, against a restored monarchy backed by the army, might seem foolish, but Bennet believed that God was on their side, and that Christ's soldiers would be undefeatable. But defeated they were, and Bennet was hanged, drawn, and quartered. The insurrection sparked one of the acts of the Clarendon Code, the Act of Uniformity, but it also spurred another religious sect to change its ways. The Quakers, with their leader George Fox, had been a rowdy bunch up until this point, and were willing and eager to disrupt other congregations with violence. But in the aftermath of Bennet's rebellion, Fox used his influence to alter their course forever. In order to distance themselves from the Fifth Monarchists, Fox published a declaration from the harmless and innocent people of God called Quakers. This denounced violence of any kind, and called for Quakers to be explicitly pacifist. This has remained a central plank of Quaker ideology ever since. A smattering of other political executions followed in subsequent years, as trials dragged on or fugitives were captured abroad and brought back for punishment. Some, like Edward Ludlow, would die in prison. 3 of the regicides, John Dixwell, Edward Warley, and William Gough, managed to escape to America and would avoid the authorities for the rest of their lives. Oliver Cromwell, Henry Ireton, Thomas Pride, and John Bradshaw had all inconveniently and rather rudely died before the Restoration, so they were exhumed from their crypts, hanged and beheaded on the 30th of January, 1661, the 12th anniversary of the regicide. John Lambert, who was not a regicide but who was exempted from the general pardon, was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. Charles commuted the death sentence to life imprisonment on the island of Guernsey. Sometimes he lived in harsh conditions. During the Second Anglo-Dutch War, there were standing orders that he be shot if an enemy landed on the island. But as the years went by, and his friends and family lobbied on his behalf, he was given a house in Guernsey to live in with his wife. And then in 1670, he was transferred to Drake's Island, a tiny rock in Plymouth Harbour. This was much more connected to the outside world, and his visitors included both Charles and his brother James. He would only die in 1683. But mostly, the leaders of the Republic and the Protectorate were spared their lives. Charles Fleetwood and John Desborough were barred from public office, but left alone. Oliver St. John was likewise spared. The Cromwell family were almost entirely unmolested. Richard Cromwell was left alone, and when he went into exile, it was because of his debts, not his time as Lord Protector. Henry Cromwell pledged loyalty to Charles, and he had plenty of admirers around the new king who sung his praises. He was allowed to keep a vast amount of Irish land, and retired to East Anglia to live the life of a country gentleman, just as his father would have done had the civil wars not erupted. Parallel to the English Act, the Irish Parliament also passed an act with an almost identical name in August. The Act of Pardon and Indemnity excluded anyone involved in the Irish Rebellion, but the king retained the right to pardon individuals for acts of loyalty to the crown. The Parliament of Scotland would pass an Act of Indemnity in 1662, which named several leading Covenanters as exceptions to the pardon and included the names of hundreds of others who had to pay fines. A couple of those exempted from the pardon were Archibald Johnson of Warriston and the late Marquis of Argyll, Archibald Campbell. And if you're wondering, hang on, when did Argyll die? Well, upon the Restoration, Argyll travelled south to welcome his king. After all, he'd crowned him all the way back in 1651 at Scone. Yes, Charles had hated the experience, but surely bygones would be bygones. They were not. Argyll turned up at the Palace of Whitehall and requested to see the king. Instead, Charles sent an officer to arrest him for treason. Argyll had at least partly expected this, and he'd made preparations by transferring many of his estates to his heir, another Archibald Campbell. This Archibald Campbell held unimpeachable royalist credentials. Young Archibald had joined Glencairn's Rising. If you recall our episodes on that, we did discuss whether the Campbells had fallen on both sides of the conflict, so that one way or another the family would survive. Argyll was tried and convicted of treason by the Parliament of Scotland, based on his cooperation with the Protectorate regime during Glencairn's Rising. He'd been cooperating with George Monk, who might have put in a good word for him, but Argyll was a known quantity. No one trusted him. He'd been too involved with too many different factions. Plus, Charles hated him and blamed him for the indignities he'd suffered during his short reign in Scotland. The men now in charge of Scotland on the king's behalf hated him even more. He was sentenced to death, and on the 27th of May he was embraced by the Maiden, an ancestor to the guillotine. In a singular mark of pettiness, his head was then placed on the same spike which had once held that of the Marquis of Montrose, the arch-royalist who Argyll had executed. And as an aside, something I didn't realise until I actually visited in person, but St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh has elaborate memorials to both Argyll and Montrose, facing each other across the aisle, with the national covenant displayed between them. For some reason no one else found that as funny as I did. Johnson of Warriston, chief author of the National Covenant and architect of the Scottish Revolution, had sensibly fled the country and was sentenced to death in absentia. When he was arrested in France, Louis XIV sent him back to his frenemy Charles. He sat in the Tower of London, but soon followed Argyll to the scaffold in Edinburgh on the 22nd of July 1663. These are just a few of the individual fates of the Restoration, but the return of the Stuarts meant more than just a few executions. It also meant a lot of dashed hopes from less connected royalists. One of George Monk's conditions for the Restoration was that Charles not meddle with the redistribution of land which had taken place over the last decade. Vast tracts of land had been confiscated from royalists and sold by the parliamentarian and republican governments. Monk, for personal reasons as well as political pragmatism, didn't want the king to come back and declare that all that land had to go back to its previous owners. If land was going to be returned, then that should be up to Parliament. Charles's declaration of Breda had made this promise, but it was a bit of a fib. Predictably, he reclaimed the crown's estates, but with the restoration of the episcopacy in all three kingdoms, the bishops also had their confiscated land restored. This was usually compensated with cash or land in Ireland, but not always, particularly when they'd been held by parliamentarians. But other than restoring the estates of these two pillars of royal authority, and a few lucky royalists at court, Charles more or less kept his word. Parliament was left to handle the difficult work of sorting out years of fines, confiscations, and compensation, and the many unpopular decisions this would involve. This was a point of tension between the early years of his rule for the many royalists who were left high and dry. Many had had their land confiscated by the victorious Parliament, and they had expected this to be reversed when their true king returned. But political pragmatism got in the way. That land had been sold and resold. Its new owners included influential figures, and the stability of the restoration was shaky enough without reversing a decade of land ownership. Dispossessed landowners would have to rely on individual court cases or debates in Parliament, and only rarely received refunds for fines they'd paid to the Republican government for their loyalty to the monarchy. Most high-profile figures would get most of their estates back, one way or another, but it took time. It left a sour taste in their mouths to have to spend months and years going through the courts when most of their previous oppressors were left untouched, with some even profiting in money and status from their crimes. One of those furious was the Dowager Countess of Derby. Her husband, James Stanley, the 7th Earl of Derby, had been executed after the Battle of Worcester. She'd fled the Isle of Man as parliamentarian troops landed. With the Restoration, her son, the 8th Earl of Derby, was restored to the title of Lord of Man. Neither mother nor son were interested in this whole live and let live thing. When a Manxman, William Christian, or Iliam Doane to the Manx, returned to the island, they saw an opportunity for revenge. Doane had surrendered the island to Parliament and then helped Sir Thomas Fairfax govern it. He'd fled the island before the Restoration, but he'd been advised that any repercussions for his collaboration with the Republic were forbidden under the English Act of Indemnity. But as a Manx national hero like Doane should have known, the Isle of Man is not part of England. Its laws did not and do not apply. So when he landed back on the island, he was arrested for his crimes, not against the king, but the Lord of Man. He was convicted of treason and executed by firing squad. King Charles told the Stanley family off for going against the spirit, if not the law, of the Act of Indemnity, and ordered that his family's property be returned, but that was all too late for Doane. He's gone down in history as a Manx folk hero against English oppression. Speaking of English oppression, let's head north of the border, where a once again independent Scotland was reckoning with nearly a decade of English occupation. The Restoration in Scotland, supported by landed elites who welcomed a return to stability, was an almost absolute reassertion of royal power, and absolute is the right word to use here. The new royal administration in Edinburgh was led by the restored Scottish Privy Council, which was dominated by the Earls of Glencairn, Middleton and Lauderdale. Their authority was backed up by the unwavering support of the judiciary. When the Parliament of Scotland met in 1661, they overturned all the constitutional developments which had come out of the Scottish Revolution. The Scottish Rescissory Act annulled all acts passed by the Covenanter Parliaments, including the ones which Charles I had assented to after the Bishops' Wars. Other instruments of royal power were revived. The Lords of the Articles, men chosen directly or indirectly by the king, who decided what Parliament would discuss, was back. The slate was wiped clean, back to the 1630s. This meant the wholesale rejection of the covenants and covenanting. The National Covenant, one of the most fascinating documents of mass politics in the 17th century, was banned. A new oath of loyalty was put into effect. All office holders had to swear to uphold the king's authority and reject any and all covenants. Hundreds would not do so, and were expelled from their positions, particularly in the covenanting heart of the southwest. Royal propaganda painted the Covenanters and Presbyterians in general as responsible for the civil wars in England and, by extension, the murder of their Scottish king, Charles. The minority Covenanter position was that Charles II was betraying the covenant he had sworn to in 1652. Particularly galling for die-hard Covenanters who were watching their godly gains being stripped away and who felt the hard boot of official persecution was that the men implementing this had all once been Covenanters. And as hard as the government will squeeze these last holdouts, the Covenanters were not going anywhere soon. Just like in England, religious uniformity was shattered forever. One of the godly reforms which were reversed was, of course, the abolition of episcopacy. Just like in England and Ireland, the bishops were back. 4 new bishops were consecrated in London, including the new Archbishop of St Andrews, James Sharp. He would become the face and leader of the restored kirk, with all the good and ill that brings him. One innovation from the Revolution which the Restoration government did like was its money. The assessment, or the cess, was an incredibly efficient and lucrative means of raising revenue, and the royal administration decided that this was a perfectly reasonable innovation to keep. But as memories of the Revolution and the conquest and humiliation of Scotland fade, and the honeymoon period of the Restoration passes, Scots will become much more willing to criticise the government, and will use their parliament as a vehicle for this. Now we turn to Ireland, where the Protestant elite, new and old, watched events in England with some anxiety. They had overthrown the junto, with Lord Brokehill leading the way, but a royalist restoration posed a significant threat to their positions. Who among them hadn't worked with the Commonwealth? Some of them, like Brokehill, had actively fought against the Stuarts. The king was surrounded by Catholic Irish supporters who would naturally expect to be rewarded for their loyalty with the return and expansion of their estates. What if the king came back and ordered that the Cromwellian settlement be reversed in full? Charles had to decide which of his Irish subjects he would support. His Protestant ones, who had mostly fought against his family, but who did hold all the levers of power in Ireland, or his Catholic ones, who were much more favourable towards him, but who were essentially powerless. He also had to consider his other 2 kingdoms, where a lot of the current holders of Irish land actually lived, and how they would react. At the end of November, Charles had made his decision, and published the Gracious Declaration. All Protestant royalists had their estates restored to them. The Marquis of Ormond, now Duke of Ormond, as well as Lord Inchiquin, led the way. The king also ordered the restoration of several notable Catholic landowners who had held firm to their royalist principles in the face of the Protectorate, and either went into exile or remained on their former lands as tenants. The declaration named 38 individuals who, without any further investigation or process, would have their full estates returned to them. These were the leaders of the Irish Confederacy who had gone along with Ormond's peace treaty, including the Marquis of Clanrickard, Viscount Muskerry, and Viscount Taaffe. A further 200 Catholic officers who had gone abroad to fight in the wars of the old European regimes were likewise rewarded by the king. However, if any of this land had been within the towns and cities of Ireland, they were still not allowed back inside. They got land nearby, but Protestant control of urban Ireland was left untouched. Charles and his advisers were keen to avoid any dangerous resentment from the new Protestant elites of Ireland. Anyone who'd had their land used as compensation for these restored Catholics were therefore to be compensated themselves with land elsewhere in the kingdom. But for the vast majority of Irish Catholic landowners who had been transplanted west, there was no relief. If they had accepted new land under the Cromwellian settlement, even a third of their original holdings, they were stuck. The Gracious Declaration established a new year zero for Irish land ownership. Forget the earlier plantations, or even how things had been in 1641. As Micheál Siochrú puts it, 1659 became, quote, the benchmark for all future land claims, consolidating the Cromwellian land settlement in the process, and dashing the hopes of Irish Catholics, end quote. The Parliament of Ireland was now nearly entirely Protestant, with only a smattering of Irish Catholics in the House of Lords. Allowances were made in the early years of the Restoration, with the Act of Settlement in 1662 and the Act of Explanation in 1655, which opened the door to some appeals, but far from all. Irish Catholics were now nearly entirely dispossessed and disenfranchised, and the Protestant ascendancy was secured. In spring 1661, it was high time for Charles to be crowned King of England. Compared to his only other coronation as King of Scots, this was a dazzling affair. Unlike his crowning at Scone, which had tried to impress upon the young king the limits and the responsibilities of his position, the English coronation was a 3-day revival of the power of monarchy. No expense was spared. On the first day, the 22nd of April, Charles made a royal progress from the Tower of London to Whitehall Palace. Cheering crowds lined the streets, scattering petals in front of the procession. At its head was a cohort of some of the most powerful men in England, all dressed for the occasion in their fanciest robes and armour. Royal chaplains and judges, aldermen, noblemen, and the Knights of the Bath. They paraded through 4 80-foot-high triumphal arches, constructed of wood and cloth. These were painted and decorated, and they were not subtle in their symbolism. One showed a woman representing rebellion, being chased away by another woman representing monarchy. Another depicted Charles defeating a figure called Usurpation, who looked remarkably like one Oliver Cromwell. Just ahead of the king rode the former Admiral of the Republic and the new Earl of Sandwich, Edward Montague. Right behind the king rode the former Commander-in-Chief of the Republic and new Duke of Albemarle, George Monk. The king himself rode a horse gifted to him by Thomas Fairfax. This was all a display of royal power and divine right. It was a message to Charles's people, his subjects, not his fellow citizens, that he was the latest in a long, unbroken line of English monarchs. But the legacy of the Republic was present, even when it wasn't obvious. No one watching would have recognised that the horses in the procession had come from Cromwell's own stables, nor would they have known that the horse gifted to Charles by Fairfax, which he was currently riding, was a foal of the horse Fairfax had ridden at the Battle of Naseby. On the second day, Charles was crowned in Westminster Abbey, but not with the crown of his father. That had been ceremonially melted down after the regicide. A new one had been crafted by Cromwell's goldsmiths, and it, St. Edward's crown, is still in use today. The anointing spoon, which had been sold as a curiosity when the Republic was declared, was dutifully returned by its new owner. After cries of God Save the King ran out, commemorative medals were given out to the congregation. Another tradition. They showed Charles being crowned by peace, but these had been made by Cromwell's engraver. When the king's pardon was read aloud, another coronation staple, it was the broadest one ever seen, asking the king's subjects to forgive and forget. Those present pledged loyalty to the king, and this naturally included many who had fought hard against his father. The next day was dominated by feasts, bonfires, fireworks, and a city partying, as if to make up for the last 20 years. So, Charles is back on his thrones. He is king of 3 kingdoms and their dominions across the sea, and he has just had a glamorous coronation. But despite the parade, and the medals, and the crown, and the horses, and the oil, and the oaths of loyalty, something had been missing. Something, or someone, which would have completed the picture and promised the stability of the monarchy into the next generation. A queen. Next time, we will welcome to our story Catherine of Braganza, a princess of Portugal. She will bring England and her royal husband many things: an alliance with a serious colonial power, the promise of heirs, and an ongoing political sore over her devout Catholicism. But it is her dowry which marks England's next step into empire. At the signing of the marriage contract, England would take ownership of the North African port of Tangiers and the islands of Bombay on the west coast of India. One of those would be short-lived, but the other is going to present England and the East India Company specifically with a serious opportunity. Thank you to my Patreon House of Lords. To celebrate the start of a new season, I'm offering new patrons a 25% discount off their first month. Up until the 8th of October 2025, simply go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica and click the link at the top of the page. Membership gives you access to an ad-free feed for all of my podcasts, as well as bonus content. If you have a specific title in mind, drop me a message and I'll include it in your shout-out. For other great podcasts on the Airwave Network, check out airwavemedia.com. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.